Welcome, everyone. All right, everyone. Today, let's just go. We're going to do a quick overview, quick-ish overview of where we are and what we're studying. So, if you are relatively new to this, then or brand new, then Bhaja Govindam, that is what we're studying. This companion study with Sadhvi Aparna. That's me. In this limited series, which will be continuing through about mid-May, plus or minus a few days as we need. In this limited series, we're going to be exploring 8 themes that arise in this text. Bhaja Govindam is also known as the Moha Mudgara, or the hammer of our delusions. So this text, the reason it's called the hammer is because it lays down a lot of potentially painful truths that actually help us to break through our conditioning, break through those learned personality beliefs that keep us from seeing the reality, the deep reality, the truth, the one truth. And we'll be talking about that one truth. And that one truth is that we are all one. And that this idea that we are separate from one another is actually not true. And if we can start to understand that, then we can get to the core of what we're trying to experience and learn. So in this class, we're going to be looking at 4 key ways in which we stay trapped in samsara. You can go back. And we'll get into the specifics of that. And then eventually, and sort of throughout, we're sprinkling throughout, we're going to see 4 key ways in which we may find liberation from this samsara, or this changeable world that appears real but is constantly changing, that is impermanent, and that makes up our experience of every day. So if you have not yet watched Acharya Shunya's teachings, I highly encourage you to watch the original Bhaja Govindam teachings. This class that I'm leading is in relation to that class. So it is a way that we can come together and explore some of these themes. There are many ways in which one could explore the themes of Bhaja Govindam, an individual, even one single verse we could spend a long time with. Because what we're trying to do here, and you can stop sharing, what we're trying to do here is explore how to make this knowledge our own wisdom. So how to take this information that's come in through Shravanam, through hearing of the teacher's words, how to internalize that, and how do we make it our own? And that starts first by hearing, but then the way we make any knowledge our own. And what does it mean to make it our own? It means to integrate it into our everyday life so that we can know the truth of it. And the way we do that first is we start with something called mananam, and that's that contemplation. So this whole companion series and everything we're going to talk about today and ongoing is about kind of starting to get our mind into this process of thinking more deeply, of contemplating, of seeing not just Advaita Vedanta, or the knowledge of the Vedas that is the truth of the self, is not something that is dogma. In fact, it's very specifically not about just regurgitation, because we can't cross that Rubicon from book knowledge, from intellectual understanding to experiential by just mindlessly accepting something. Now, we have to have a functional trust in what we're learning so that we stay with the process. But it's this kind of mananam that we're doing together. And then after this class, I want you to take whatever you've started thinking about. We're going to have a couple contemplation exercises. Whatever you start thinking about today, keep going with it. Make it a thought provoker in your own life. Start to see how, and we're going to be talking about some juicy stuff today, which is relationships, right? So start to see how relationships, how does this knowledge impact your understanding of your relationships, your most intimate relationships, and maybe your most distant, and start observing. Start listening to these words of Bhaja Govindam and see see how it applies to your life. So this series is to see how we can start to apply this knowledge to each of our life so that it can act as that hammer against our own confusions and our own illusions and our own expectations, and start breaking away some of that. All right, let's see where we're at. So we talked about 4 themes. Today we're going to be focusing on the third theme of letting go. So this whole text, one way we can look at it is that Adi Shankaracharya and his students, who are also in this text, giving their own suggestions, their own verses. So his most senior students are also putting in their word from their experiences of Adi Shankaracharya's teachings. And so we're sort of looking at it with this idea of like, what are 4 things that we can let go in our life? And then what are 4 things we can pick up in our life? So throughout this text, we'll see some things that we're allowed to let go and encouraged to let go. One of those revolves around relationships and this illusory nature of relations. And so how are we've talked in the past about impermanence, and many of the earlier sessions have been about impermanence and grappling with this understanding of impermanence. Thank you for sharing that. And so relationships are really one of our most difficult of our worldly attachments to have a dispassionate understanding of. And so today I wanted to start with kind of setting the stage. Where are we at, and why, and how does this apply to our understanding of relationships? So let's review. What is discernment? What is viveka? We're asked to have discernment in Jnana Yoga, in this understanding of the self. And so discernment, or viveka, is a key part of how we will begin to understand what is absolute reality and what is adaptive or conditional reality. And so what is Govindam, which Bhaja Govindam is asking us to turn to Govindam, turn to the eternal, turn to absolute reality, and turn away from all of these things. And so it helps first that we understand what that discernment is. And so, because once we understand this right discernment between what's truth and what appears to be true, between the shadow of our ego, or ahamkara, and the reality, the bright glowing light of the self. And so we want to understand that, and this is important, this discernment. We want to cultivate that right discernment. And the way we cultivate a right discernment is by continuing to look at what is impermanent in the world. Because if it's impermanent, then it isn't absolute reality. It can change at any moment. So we've looked at some things that are impermanent in the world, and relationships, however much we want them to be permanent, are quite impermanent. So let's bring that slide up again too. I want to see that one more. Just to clarify, we want to understand what's permanent and impermanent, real and appearing as real. What is the ahamkara, or the ego, and what is the self? What's motivating us to function within everyday reality, and what is keeping us from turning towards something absolute and real? So if we have this right discernment, if we really understand this right discernment, and we're able to see this, and all of Bhaja Govindam is encouraging us in ways that we can see, ways that we can really start to discern, and encouraging us to contemplate rightly, so that we can start to enhance that viveka, or that discernment, which will then naturally lead to correct vairagyam, or that's the disassociation from the unreal, which is samsara. So if we can, the idea is that if we really knew what was real and unreal, and we really understood that, then we would stop pursuing the unreal. We'd stop pursuing all these things that make up samsara. And then without that coloration, without that raga, without that excessive attachment to our desires and aversions, raga and dvesha, then if you took away all that, then what's underneath? What's revealed is the true self. But that's a big ask, right? It's a big ask to turn away, to disassociate from all of these things that appear as reality. So every time we look into some new verse of Bhaja Govindam, we're going to start to get some questions that help us to do that. You can stop sharing for a second. So the big ask in relationships, right, in this context is really about what our ego wants, right? Like, relationships are tricky because we want that. We want, it's one thing to say, yes, this is impermanent. I can see it's impermanent. And yet, how many of us have found ourselves holding on, clenching as hard as we can internally to those relationships around us? I see a lot of nodding heads. Yes, yes, everyone here has done that. So what are the things that keep us from, what are the ways in which those relationships are impermanent? It can be from death. It can be from, there's so many ways that relationships are impermanent. Someone moves, someone dies, someone maybe in a negative way deceives us. In some way we're separated from them, or they just leave. This is the nature of relationships. We think they're permanent, and especially I'm reminded of like our young loves, our first loves. Like nothing could have told our early selves that we would ever be free. Like nothing was worse than the ending of that relationship, and nothing would tell our young selves that we would ever feel differently. And yet that's considered a natural part of our evolution and growth, is that puppy love, or that young love that meant so much to us, that felt so real and so permanent, is like a distant memory as we age, as we go on. And then we start to see how life impacts, how things change. We're going to talk about how our relationships are impermanent and the ways in which they are, but they are very closely held. This is a worldly attachment. We talked last time about worldly attachments and how everything in the world is impermanent, and relationships are one of the most impermanent, and yet one of the most strongly held attachments. Worldly attachments, like how many of us hold on, and it starts from the very moment we're born. We have these attachments and relationships, and there's this term of disassociation from the unreal. We're asked to disassociate. Now, disassociation may not be the correct word. I encourage all of us to think of it also as de-identification with, right? Disassociation, the ego can say like that the right way then is to just get rid of all relationships. And if I'm just living in a bubble, right? If I'm just living in a bubble, and I don't have any relationships, then I'll know the self. Is that true? No, I see. Yep. No, a lot of you know this is not true. This lineage that we are all part of, or participating in, is known as a grihastha lineage. That means that we are a householder lineage. It means that we are a spiritual lineage which engages in relationship, both in terms of intimate relations, as in our teachers have had partners, and our, from way back, our specific in living teacher has a husband, has children. Her grandfather, who was her teacher, had a wife and children, but and so on and so forth. And it also means that as a Grahasta lineage, is that we may have moments or times where we, go inwards with the ego, go inwards with our personality self, and we have our practices, we have our spiritual practices, we have our moments to ourself, our contemplations, but we live in the world, right? Relations are not only those intimate relations between family members or partners. We're talking about all of those relationships which involve engaging in the world. And so all of these relationships we're asked to consider. We're asked to consider their import and their impact. And then see, are they leading us closer to our sense of self and our awareness of self, or are they leading us farther away? And yet, this is just to clarify, we're not asked to let go and disassociate from others, right? That's not part of this teaching, although it would be easy, right? It seems like it would be easy to just cut ourselves off and, yep, there I am, enlightened. That's not going to take us there. So we have to learn how to be in relationship, but not be identified with those relationships. So can we hold, again, I always have this image, can we hold our relationships with open hands without grasping, without clutching, without forcing away? Can we do something that is a different way of being? All right, let's talk about this ego, or this ahamkara, this part of us that wants to engage with the outer world as though it is permanent and real. So Bhaja Govindam started off speaking about, one of the early verses says that essentially is talking about our ego, our identification of self, as our identification of our limited self, as a kind of a pathology, right? It's the disease that confuses us and doesn't let us see the underlying structure of truth. And so in this pathology of ego, we have to look at it. What does it mean? So Bhaja Govindam tells us everyone suffers from the same disease, abhimana, or egotism, conceit, and pride. This egotism that we have isn't always, it's not necessarily a feeling of better, like, oh, I'm super awesome, and therefore if I'm not egotistical, then I don't have this pathology of ego. What Adi Shankaracharya is referring to here is our conception of our limited self as though that is who we are. So we think of ourselves as something that we are not. We think of ourselves in a limited way. We have an image that we've created of who we are, and that egotism is due to this presence of the ahamkara, or the ego. That limited sense of self then tries to control life to make it go our way, and tries to control others, the people in our life, the other egos that we engage with, to try to make things go our way. Therefore, conditions are created. So conditions in all of our relationships come up. We have conditional expectations. We have desires. And when those desires aren't met, or when that temporary bliss that we experience ends, this comes up in relationships maximally, then we start to feel shoka, or grief, at every change, right? This is how the relationship curdles. This is how it changes, because my ego meets your ego, and we both had expectations and desires, and we both had our We both had our limited sense of what this should be to meet our own needs. And when those aren't met, this sukha, this temporary happiness that we thought, oh, I'm always going to be perfectly in love and everything's wonderful. And this person that I've met satisfies my needs and they're great and they're serving this image that I had, this expectation I had. And when that expectation is not met, we feel this grief. And that will then continue to curdle as long as we're holding on to that illusion. So, what is an expectation? It is a desire that may or may not have any basis in any kind of absolute reality, right? And so if that illusionary desire, if that expectation doesn't get met, we get sad, and then that sadness turns to anger, and then that anger turns to greed, to more greed, and then that greed turns to complete disillusionment and complete separation from self in its most extreme form. So this is where we can see that finally our happiness is not going to last as long as we stay identified with this ego. And what happens is more desires, more attachments, more delusions, and more dependence. Thank you for sharing that slide. So we've set the stage. We know that our ego is causing us to see things not as they are. We know that our ego, we've talked about the storm of desires that happens, that feeds this never enoughness and that leads to more and more desires. And so we have these desires, we look outside of ourselves to have them met. We look at other people, we look at other situations, we look at relationships, and we seek something. We seek fulfillment of our desires. This is a stage for relationships. As long as we're in our illusion, as long as we're identified with the temporary, identified with the impermanent. So what are relationships in that context? Let's share that slide. So in that context, relationships, we see these worldly relationships, and we keep expecting. We don't hold the same. Do we hold the same standards for other people and ourselves? We expect unconditional love from other people, right? Do we always give unconditional love to other people? No, but we keep expecting. How dare this unconditional love not be given to me? Adi Shankaracharya says you're delusional. That's complete delusion to even expect unconditional love from our worldly relationships. Why? Because it's two egos coming together. It's two pathological expressions of impermanence, seeking permanence from one another, both delusional, both incapable of meeting that. Because we're still identified. This is why we want to turn our identification from this ego that just wants its own. If two beings that just want their own needs met, they have their own desires. Sometimes those desires work together, right? And this is where you have that synchronicity of like, I'm in flow with this person and everything's perfect and wonderful. And then something changes. Those desires are no longer in the same alignment. And then what's left? Two egos going up against one another. Dukkha, sorrow. So, what we're asked to do in Bhaja Govindam, in terms of relationships, are to start exploring what are we expecting from other people, right? Because this discernment is going to help us to get to this dispassion. Like the more that we understand our own motivations, and then we can see around those motivations to our own attachment to this impermanent thing that is delusional, then the more we can start to create a little space in between our expectation and the reality And in that space, we can find peace. In that space, we can find distance. And in that space, we can find a little glimmer of that inner self. So back to this relationships, we know that if we keep expecting unconditional love from each of these relationships, we're probably delusional, and we can each talk about and explore for ourselves, how are we doing that? What are the ways in your life that you expect unconditional love, and are you providing that for others, or is that probably not going to happen? And so the next question is, do we love people for their own sake, or do we love them for what they mean to us? And this is what the next several verses are going to be that we're going to explore today. Unconditional love, we're taught in Adi Shankaracharya teaches us in other texts, and also in this one, that unconditional love only happens in a few places. Our inner heart self, and that heart self is what's revealed to us by Guru and by Jnanam, this knowledge of the self. So until we understand what is real and what is unreal, we can't actually hope to find or give unconditional love. We need a source of that. It's also found in ultimate reality. And those two things are one. We think they're separate, but they're one. But for now, we're going to look to that place within us where there may be a way to access true unconditional love, separate from our desires, separate from our expectations, separate from our needs from others. And then we can connect to, how do we connect to that love? And this is going to be one of those flowers that Adi Shankaracharya, we have the hammer, and then we also have these flowers, these ways in which we can find that inner self, and these ways in which we can separate more and more from the delusion of samsara. And one of the verses today, 25 especially, is all about that part. That part especially, how we're starting to see, we're getting closer, we're starting to see tools that are given to us, ways in which we can break through the illusion. All right. We can also find it through satsang with a jnani, or with a knowledgeable teacher who has experienced that abiding love, the unconditional love of the self. All right. So before we dive into some of these verses, how is everyone feeling about relationships? Have you been contemplating this? Or have you been contemplating the impermanence part, or your own worldly attachments over the last couple of weeks? You're welcome to share in the chat. All right. While we keep that going, you're also welcome. Actually, I can open it up. We can have a minute or two. If anybody has anything that they want to share around the theme of worldly attachments, or have you already started contemplating how this Bhaja Govindam can help you to navigate relationships? There's no right or wrong answer, and you don't have to feel pressured to say it. In the chat, we see that Sachira has shared how to raise your hand. Although I am looking at your things. All right, we have one chat so far saying, that reminder, do we love people for their own sake or what they mean to us? That felt like a hammer for me. I realize now that my desire for my children to be happy is actually about my desire to feel like a good mom. It's hard to sit with that, but it's true. Yeah. I think that's a really powerful expression of that truth, Devi Priya. Thank you. I also find that does anyone else find that their desires for other people to be happy is also due to their discomfort with the unhappiness part? I see a couple nodding heads. Yeah. Sometimes we want other people to be happy, to make us feel like a good person. We've done our job. We've fulfilled our roles. We're going to talk about roles in a moment. Um, like Devi Priya said, there's a role that she feels good about fulfilling that is measured by the happiness of her children. So her dharma as a mother, if she has fulfilled that, what goes along with it? What's the I know I've done well in relationship if my children are doing well. As a mother, if they're happy, then that is a gold star, right? Roles are roles in relationship. Acharya Shunya shared in one of these sessions, she said, at best we can hope for dharmic relationships. We cannot hope for permanent relationships, and that's just an illusion. We're just stuck in our own nonsense if we believe that any of these relationships are permanent. At best, we can hope for dharmic relationships. So some of the ways in which we can have a dharmic relationship, or if we fulfill those roles, and yet in this text we're asked, is there something beyond? Can we understand that there's something beyond even those dharmic roles? I believe someone had asked in another session or online in our community forum, had asked about dharmic roles and this relationship with Bhaja Govindam. And I hesitated to answer that because I want you all to have this contemplation for yourself of where our roles, however important, however dharmic, are still not going to get us to realization of self. We still do them because we're part of the world. This is the entirety of the Bhagavad Gita, is teaching us how to be part of the world in an ethical, right manner, to be dharmic, to fulfill those roles. And yet, we still will not know the self only through that. So we have to start thinking in terms, for Bhaja Govindam, we have to start thinking not to push away relationship because we're of the world, but to see how there's still, even within those dharmic experiences, which we want to do, we want to put in terms of karma and accruing karma and relieving suffering in the world, it's good to fulfill roles as we are able and to be a dharmic person. We're going to go into that a lot I'm going to be working on a 2-year program on dharmic, on fulfilling our dharma through the Bhagavad Gita. And yet we're still talking about the temporary. Yeah. Another share, 2 shares. One, Devi Priya responds that she's noticing now that the desire to be good can never come from others or the outside, only from a connection to my Atman and Govinda. Yeah, I think even the desire, this is a little much for this class, but even the desire to be good is still our ego. There is Dharma is that which sustains us all. And that means like the planets, it means the universe, it means our experience of reality. There are, preferential and beneficial reasons to follow things that sustain, and there's reasons not to follow things that don't sustain. And yet that desire to be good, the desire to be seen as good, the desire to be experienced as good, this is all still from ego. It doesn't mean that it isn't preferential, right? We've talked about the gunas, the qualities of the mind, the rajas, the tamas, and the sattva. And there are reasons for choosing that which is more sattvic. But I do want to encourage us to look at, especially coming from the West, where we can look at these concepts of what is good and what is bad, and where are we attaching that to a identification with sin, and there's a lot of loaded connotations with good and bad. Doesn't mean that there is moral relativism. It just means that we should pay attention to how our ego expresses itself and looks for those gold stars, and just start to contemplate that of, am I doing this because I am supporting the underlying truth of reality because I am connected to it? Or am I doing this because I'm looking for external validation? And that's one way in which we engage in relationship, right? All right, so we have a couple of more shares. Pragya shares that she's been working on finding unconditional love through bhakti. The teaching that there really is no unconditional love in samsara is really clarifying. So stop looking there. Yeah. And it doesn't mean, oh, and also she shares, and having her own needs met with her relationship with the divine takes the pressure off relationships. Yeah, see, right? That's a really helpful experience of what it means to disidentify with relationships in the context of, if we had relationships and didn't expect them to be anything other than what they were, we would make different choices both on who we're in relationship with, and we would also be more free if we are connected to the divine, as Pragya is working on, is more free if we don't place that pressure on all of these other pathological egos, engaging with our pathological ego, never meeting our needs, our desires, or our expectations. There's freedom there, right? And in that freedom, we can actually act more in alignment with freedom, more in alignment with God, right? More in alignment with the divine. We can, as Pragya shares, she can connect more with what it might be like to act unconditionally in relationship, to expect and to love without so much of those expectations that may have nothing to do with the other person, may have been born from earlier experiences in our life or in other lives. All of these things that may literally be a complete illusion that we're creating and projecting onto another person, and then getting really mad when it's not met, right? How dare they not meet the whole of my existence from lifetime to lifetime and all of those habituated expectations, or even the whole of my experience up until now through every relationship that has never fulfilled those needs. Right? And finally, Sakshi shares, when life is looking good, I do say to myself, even this will change. And that always brings a little sadness, but then a knowing that touches something deep inside that all will be fine. A feeling of a love, a deep love. Yeah. Shunyiji shares that, everything that, this is the nature of this reality. Everything that we think is bringing us sukha or pleasure or happiness because of temporariness will inevitably bring us sorrow, pain, dukkha. And everything that we find is bringing us, that we avoid, that we're running away from, or that we think is going to bring us a lot of pain, there is a potential, if we're paying attention, to find sukha even in that, through our understanding, through our detachment, right? We're probably a little more likely to cultivate detachment, disassociation when things are painful than when they're pleasurable. It's a little harder when things are going our way to say, okay, this also is temporary. Yeah. Rochelle shares, fulfilling our dharma as outlined in the Gita, but self-realization has to go beyond this as an individual soul level. Yes, that's the, that is absolutely what we're talking about here. Self-realization is different than following dharma. We want to follow dharma within the context of the way that we live in the world, and we have guidelines and tools and resources. Every religion has understandings of how to be, a main part of religion is to help us to act better in the world. Most of the Vedas is about how to function in the world as an ethical human being, right? And then there's this part, this Vedanta part, this part that comes at the end, this knowledge that comes at the end of the Vedas into the Upanishads, which says, okay, once you have understood how to function as an ethical person in the world, you understand these, and yet even that, we're still working within samsara. And so these teachings like Bhaja Govindam, these teachings like the Upanishads, these teachings like Bhagavad Gita, these are here to help us to make that leap from the purification of the mind that comes through karma yoga, this purification of the ego that comes from acting ethically, even in difficult situations, and this knowledge that even then there's something more. We do want to be ethical. There is benefit to acting ethically in the illusion, but it's still not permanent reality, right? Okay. All right. So we've already started exploring. Let's talk about, today we're going to talk about verse 5, 6, 8, and 25 of Bhaja Govindam. In verse 5, these are the ones, the whole context of Bhaja Govindam talks a lot about relationship, because we are maximally engaged in relationship in the world. How do we relate to every single ego that we come across is an important question. And it's also where we're most attached, where we find ourselves pulled the most, and where we can get the most confused. So these particular verses kind of most directly address relationship, but all of it is about relationship as well. Just as it's about letting go, just as it's about discernment. So we will cultivate relationships in satsang, right? Where those are different kinds of relationships. We cultivate relationship in terms of, we're told, get on the boat of satsang, because those are the kind of relationships of knowledge that will help keep reminding you of truth, right? So it's not like don't have any relationships at all. So even in our tools that we're going to be exploring, even in those flowers to pick up, those things to pick up, relationship plays a part. So let's look at verse 5. So long as a man is fit and able to support his family, see what affection all those around him show. But no one at home cares to even have a word with him when his body totters due to old age. That's pretty grim. Is it true? Is it true? And what does it mean? Well, we can see right now that, I would say, it's pretty obvious, perhaps not directly related to the financial support, but what that does speak to, we can see right around us right now how we treat the elderly, right? In today's day and age, when you become tottering due to old age, we put you in a home, right? And in that home, it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't have to, the family doesn't have to worry about you anymore. Someone else is caring for it. Unfortunately, there are abuses that happen in those situations. Not always, but sometimes. Invariably, there is a thing that happens very often, and I saw it with my own father when he became sick very suddenly, and his vitality went within the space of maybe 6 months from someone who was working in the head of his office and doing all these things to, after severe cancer diagnosis and treatments and all that, to being someone who was quite frail. And within 6 months, the way that the world interacted with him was as though he was, they just saw, everyone saw something. They saw his body. They saw this body that looked frail in an old age, and they would talk over him. They would ignore him. They wouldn't pay attention to him. It was so obvious from the outside to see, oh, this is what happens immediately. No one even cares to have a word with him in his old age. And I have seen that, and I'm sure you have all witnessed that or are going to witness that as your body, as my body, as our bodies start to totter with age. So we see that the first part of this says that affection is due to the financial benefit. That's part of this is it, and what does that tell us? It's not necessarily that financial, like as long as he's fit and able to support his family, see what affection all around him shows. What does that tell us? It tells us the conditional. This is conditional and dependent affection, that it's earned. And it's saying, question for you, is this always true? Is it always true? Sometimes. I think many times. And why? We talked about it earlier. Someone brought up this idea of role, right? The roles. So we have our roles. What this verse is teaching us or telling us is that our tendency is, as long as someone is fulfilling their role in society, in this case, the father and patriarch of the family, as long as he's able to fulfill that role, he'll receive affection, right? So love is conditional there. Affection is conditional. Respect is conditional. The way in which we treat someone reminds us that is role dependent. That he can no longer count on the support of others due to his infirmity of body, old age, right? Nobody's even wants to talk with him. Sit there and think about that. When I get old, is this going to be the way that it will be? Now, we can get really sad about that. We can let this hammer bludgeon us into a reaction, or we can look to see if this hammer has some truth, right? So what is the truth? There is this tendency to ignore the old people, sick and infirm. There's another reason why we tend to not look at that. I mean, can anyone think on why we tend not even talk, right? There's an ignoring then, right? There's a separation. There's an aversion. If we're not even talking, we no longer see. And what might that relate to? Yeah, it mirrors our own fear of aging and death, Deborah shares. And Davy Priya, because we're so uncomfortable with death. Why are we uncomfortable with death? Right? That's a big question. Why are we uncomfortable with death? Why is it hard to see the people we love get old and infirm? Why do we no longer want to look at that body? We no longer want to engage with that. It feels permanent. Yeah, impermanent, right? Yeah, impermanence of our physical life. We avoid, deny, flee, ignore. Yeah, when we're faced with the reminder of the impermanence. Acharya Shunya shared at the beginning, somewhere near the beginning of the teachings on Bhaja Govindam, this idea that we, around impermanence, right? We think that everything, we attach on to all these impermanent things as though they were permanent. And then when faced with the undeniable proof of impermanence, we run away, right? We act like it isn't happening. So if we really understood impermanence, if we really knew and we really embraced the reality that nothing here is permanent. And one way to do that is by looking at old age, looking at disease, looking at death, decay, collapse, and acknowledging that it's happening. If we really could do that, then we might have a chance to turn to what is permanent. Because we know that this is impermanent. But we don't act like it's impermanent. We act like we have all the time in the world, and then we act surprised when it comes to an end, right? This Bhaja Govindam, the importance of being clear and understanding what is real and what is not real, what is permanent and what is not permanent, Earlier in the text, we learned that the reason that's important is because at the moment of our death, like there will come a time when this body does end, and at that moment we need to already be in the habit of thinking about what is real, because we will not, in that moment, as our body totters due to old age, as that impermanence affects our physical shell, the way that our mind is habituated is where we will turn. So getting on top of that now is always this. We always need to have that in the sort of the back of our mind as we're studying Bhaja Govindam. Is like, why were they telling us this? What's the point? Because we need to start really thinking about that impermanence. So if our identity is wrapped up in our roles of the ego, right? If we think that we are only our role in a relationship, whether we're father, we're mother, we're supporter, we're caretaker, we're daughter, we're son, when those roles can no longer be filled, that's what this verse is about. When those roles can no longer be filled, we don't necessarily still have a social identity. If that was our only role, we no longer have a social identity. What is our identity? Who are we? Right? If we cannot be that in relationship, in these conditional relationships, then we may find ourselves completely lost within the illusion. So if that relationship is dependent on this role fulfillment, as we learn in verse 5, then that relationship will no longer exist, right? Yeah. So let's see how that hammer's hitting everybody. I see a share from Kalyani. This hammer also applies to how society tends to treat those who are differently abled at any age, and it's such an important reminder to journey to deriving our sense of self-worth from our identity as the eternal Atma, rather than from how others may or may not view us in any given moment. Yes, that frailty of old age is also the frailty, ultimately it's the frailty of the body. So this verse is telling us, if you only identify yourself in the context of what you can do in any given moment, how you can fulfill a role to others, if that ability changes, if the ability of the body changes, if you're unable to fulfill that role, if anything alters in that, then you no longer will have an identity within society, and people tend to not see you, right? So this physical reality, this physical identity, this physical identity, and then it gets hammered in even more. So I like that, Kalyani. Thank you for reminding us that physical identity has nothing to do it tends to break down with the old age. We're guaranteed that this body will decay. If we're old enough, it will decay. But also, it is a matter of our expectations. Think about that, of our expectations that we are abled, all in the same way. We all have that unspoken expectation. Everybody can see, everybody can hear, everybody can walk, everybody can lift, everybody can do all these things, that we all have these unspoken, unacknowledged expectations of the physical reality of others. And if that expectation is not met, right? Because this is about, our relationships are about what we expect from others. We think it's about what they can give us, but it's also about what we expect from others. So if those physical expectations are not met, we run away from them, we ignore them, we don't look at them, because we're so attached. This is that deha vasana, that body consciousness, right? So here we're taught that we are so attached in relationship to bodies that when those bodies change, we no longer have relationship, right? Yeah. So let's see. So that's something that if we no longer have relationship, just because a single moment could change us, or inevitably what will affect us all if we live long enough, old age changes us, then we can see right there, then that relationship never was. that was impermanent. It was never real, right? Even to our most intimates. We thought it was, but clearly it was not. Let's go on to, yeah. Okay, sorry. We have one more chat thanking me for the example of how my father was spoken over as his body changed in such a short time and how people treated him differently. It was a helpful example for her. Yes, we somehow think, even knowing what the average lifespan is, even knowing the inevitability of the body decaying if we live long enough, even knowing that at any moment, there was a verse in there earlier that said, in the blink of an eye, in even a second of time, everything can shift in this world of illusion, in this samsara. Even logically knowing that, until we integrate what that truth means, then we will find ourselves perpetually surprised when things change, when the impermanence shows itself. All right, verse 6, let's move on to that. This again is more about the body. So we talked about roles in the last one. We learned that as long as someone is able to, if we're looking at relationships and how and what they're showing us here is, what Adi Shankaracharya is showing us here is ways in which relationships that we think are permanent are impermanent, and therefore giving us reasons to step a little bit away from those relationships and just start looking at them not as who we are, but as something separate from ourselves. So in verse 6, it says, when one is alive, his family members inquire kindly about his welfare. But when the soul departs from the body, even his wife runs away in fear of the corpse. I mean, first thought, yeah, the dead body, right? Of course, we're all gonna like, but I think that initial revulsion, who else felt an initial revulsion as soon as, even at the thought of well, do we all ask, and I'm looking at everyone here live, do we all ask that, why would anyone want to hang out next to a corpse? What on earth would we love about that corpse? Right? It seems very clear. Yeah, we're all like, ugh, it's a dead body. It's we know disease can erupt from that. We know dead bodies can have, all the things. So we know that this body is not the self. We understand that, right? Immediately without question, we know that's not the person. And yet we persist in treating this body as though that's the thing, as though that's the self, as though that's the engagement that we had relationship with. But even the most beloved person to that body runs away as soon as it's dead. Ugh. It's dead, get it away. So as long as we persist in viewing this body as self, we are identifying with an impermanent thing that will inevitably lead us to sorrow, right? We know what's left. Why is it frightening? Because it reminds us again of our own mortality. And why, but then here's this other question. So we know to run away, we know that, and this is asking us to look at, everyone, we're inquiring kindly about one's welfare, right? We all have things to say, oh, how are you doing? This is part of relationship. This is part of the role of relationship, is that we inquire after the body. How are you feeling? How is your health? How are you doing? All these things, are you caring for this meat sack? How is that for you? And we all say it as though, and we believe it with our ego minds. We believe it with our intellect that what we're asking about is the health and well-being of that being. But we're really asking about the health and well-being of that meat sack. And as soon as it's done, then we no longer have any interest in the meat sack, right? So maybe we should look to that. We could also imagine that realization is comforting, right? oh, the body died, but I already know. Why don't we see it as comforting when we see that body? Why do we run away from it? We could also, if we were really clued into that eternal self, we could see that maybe we all know that there was something else that made that person them that is no longer there, right? Has anyone ever sat with the body of a loved one after they've died? Yeah. Yeah, I have. It's quite clear. It's quite clear. What was them is no longer there. What was them is not that. And it's so immediately and viscerally understandable that there is a revulsion that sets in. There is a separation that sets in almost immediately, at least in my experience, that it was quite clear. It wasn't absolutely immediately, but it was quite clear when that part of consciousness that inhabited that body was not there. But we could consider it like contemplation. We could consider it as a comforting experience, because we actually have an experience proof that what was once that was not the body. Yeah, I'm saying some nods. Yeah, could that be comforting instead of frightening? Okay. Here's some lived experience. There was something that was inhabiting, that was infusing, that was enervating that body, which was consciousness itself. And now that's no longer infusing that body. But it doesn't mean that it no longer exists. This is a way that we can start to understand this, this relationship that we have with other bodies. We can start to see them in a different context. Yeah. Someone shares in the chat, we constantly chat about our health. It's good to remember that we have a body, not that we are the body. Deborah, I'll call on you in just one second. So if you're someone who works hard at maintaining a perfect shell, works hard at maintaining a healthy body, and you make a big deal about the welfare of the shell, it's helpful to remember this verse and to look at it. If you're someone that judges other people's bodies, I don't imagine we have too many of those egos here, but sometimes it happens whether we realize it or not, because there is this revulsion against, this is the dvesha, this raga and dvesha. If we are identified with the body and we see a body that we don't want to see contextually because it challenges our assumption of the body as self, we may find ourselves feeling revulsion. We may find ourselves feeling dvesha, and it's really helpful to dig into that in relationship, dig into that in terms of our self-identification of how is that impacting, how is that belief in body as self, the bodies of others, the bodies of ourselves, how does that impact our own expectations in terms of our own life, in terms of that conditional love, right? Yeah. And so again, we're encouraged with this one, with this verse. This really brings it home about that impermanence and how we have this moment. We have this moment of transition from when we were in a body that people inquired about affectionately, wanting to know all about our welfare, to as soon as that soul departs the body, even as that soul departs his body, everyone's running away, including your most intimates, your most intimate, your wife, your husband, your partner is running away in fear of the corpse. And so use this time wisely, right? Use it wisely, and get your jnanam of the eternal self, get that knowledge of the eternal self, soften your ego with bhakti, like Pragya shared. She's softening her ego with devotion to Ishvara. She's softening that. So in that moment of death, we can let go, right? We can let go and move into something that is more aligned with this knowledge than less. And don't hold on, because honestly, like your loved ones, this is telling us your loved ones aren't holding on. They're running away. They are. And it may take a minute. It may take a while. It doesn't mean that we don't have, in relationship, we also have grief. We have grief, the loss of this body, and really ultimately the loss of the body as sheath for the personality of our loved ones. And we don't have to, we don't have to not feel that grief. We should feel that grief, and then we can let it go. Knowing that that body was not the self, that body is just just as the Bhagavad Gita shares, the body is like a cloak we put on, and then change outfits with each death. In our chat, Marika shares that for her, sitting with the dead body of loved ones felt comforting and made contemplation about life more easy. These were sacred moments of growth. Yeah. To sit with, it's that, again, there is that, to sit with our loved ones as they pass is to integrate that knowledge. I think that is the comfort, right? It's to integrate the knowledge. Yeah. That this is, because it really hammers in of like, the person I loved is no longer there. I love them. I cared for them. When my mom passed, to sit with her body, it looked so, this body was clearly not, this was not my mom. This was not my beloved. And so I put flowers on her. I brought, I tried to bring more life as we let her, as we let that body be dissolved in fire, as we did that, I made it. But that process of sitting with her helped me to integrate. Oh yes, this body served, this body, these hands picked me up, this body literally gave birth to me. This body, did all these beautiful things. And yet, that's not my mom. It was so clear. I'm like, oh, nope, that's not her. That's not this soul that agreed to do all these things. That's not that personality who was in my life all those moments. So there is comfort if we can sit with it, and if we can sit with it with knowledge, without holding on so hard, without attaching so much. If we can sit with it, then it becomes really beautiful and clear, right? Yeah. So we don't necessarily have to have fear of the corpse. Although if a corpse was hanging out, I would, there's things to fear in terms of our physical health. But I think understanding that this was not, that whatever this body was, we see it most clearly in death. Whatever this body was, it was not permanent. It was not the real, right? All right. Deborah, did you want to share something? Oh, no, you're okay. Great. Don't hesitate to ask if you do. Yes. And Devi Priya shares, this discussion reminds me of the teaching when Shunyiji shared that some sampradayas held their satsangs on the funeral pyre and put ashes on their foreheads to be constantly reminded of impermanence. I have done a practice of naming things I see that are dying, and it has helped me to embrace impermanence a bit more. Yes, what is dying in this world? This is also, this dimension is called Mrityu Loka, which means this is the dimension of death, of impermanence. And so in our closing prayer, we will pray that we see what is, that we see what is real, that we see the truth, that we know the truth so well that we can see that this Mrityu Loka is temporary, and that what we thought was death is actually a transition into a reality of permanence. So yes. All right, let's move on. So in verses 5 and 6, we've talked about roles. We see that our relationships, if they're being upheld only through our roles, like that's what gives us value. What happens if that role can no longer be fulfilled? Well, those relationships can fall to the side. We found out, we looked in verse 6 at our bodies, our body attachments, and that if our relationships are solely due to our body existing, then that relationship cannot be permanent, right? if it only exists as long as the body does, then therefore the body will die, the body will age and decay or fall due to an accident or whatever can transpire. And there's an infinite number of things that can transpire in this loka to cease this body from being. But if our body is the only one having relationship, then that too is impermanent. All right, let's go into verse 8. Again, we're still looking at like, what are all the ways in which this whole thing is a setup of like, let's start looking at relationships because we do think of them as permanent. So if we think of them as permanent because of the roles that we held, like a lead, all leaders, if your only role of reverence and relationship is in leadership and you can't fulfill that, no one cares about you anymore. If it's about serving others in terms of if you're a mother, all of the, and your children inevitably want to grow up and go away. And that's how you actually know you're a good mom. You've fulfilled that role, is if they are successfully able to keep going without your interference and love and clingy love. And, there's so many ways in which our roles that we think are the basis of our relationships, there is impermanence. And as bodies even, if our role, this sexy body will change, that body that you're in love with, well, it's going to decay. All the ways in which our bodies will not sustain this. So then we move into verse 8. Who is your wife? Who is your son? Who are these people that you think are your relationships and that you identify yourself in relation to, that you identify yourself in relation with? So who are these? Who are these people? Strange is this samsara, the world. This world is strange. This is a weird place, right? It's so weird. It changes. So who is this? Who determined that this soul in this body was going to be your wife and that this soul in this body is your son or your daughter or your husband or your uncle or your tribe or your best friend, or you think that you have control over these things, but you didn't set up any of these situations. So who are they? How did they come to be in your life? How did you actually come to be in relation with them? This is a strange samsara. This is a strange world that we live in. Of whom are you? Of whom are you? If these people are of you, who are you from? And from where have you come? Where did you come from? You now know that you were that this body that you see in others is ending, and yet their consciousness was there. They had knowledge, they had experience. There's something in there that you attach to. Well, the same must be true of you. The same must be true of me. So where have we come from? Brother, ponder over these truths. Let's talk about that, and then we're going to ponder over these truths together. All right. We identify ourselves by the relationships in our life, right? I'm so-and-so's daughter. You're so-and-so's mother or father. You are someone based on who begat you, right? The Bible, the Christian Bible is full of so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. So the lineage, right? Our lineage, our sampradaya has a lineage, right? But who are these people to us? Did we choose them? Do we know them? Why are they important to us? Why are they special? These are all contemplations that we should start to have in terms of our relationships, because they will reveal that you don't actually have answers for these. And so it's not going to come. I mean, you can speculate, and those speculations immediately come back to the conditions of those relationships. They immediately come back to how you are related in utility to these people, because you don't actually know We don't actually know why this soul came into our experience. Why we don't have that information. We don't know why this consciousness. We know why we like to keep people around. We know what they do for us. We know how they make us feel, right? They make us feel good. So we like it. Or they do this thing for us, and or they give us meaning by serving their needs, or all of these things. It's all pointing back to some truth that we're trying to not see, right? We're trying to not see that, like, we don't know. You don't know. Do you know? Do you know where the soul came from? Where it's going to go? Do you know? Do you know how it came to be that you were born into the family, that you were begat by this or that? Do you know? Do you know that? We don't know. So this is what we're asked to contemplate. This is that. Okay, this is that mononym, right? This is that deep mononym that we're asked to do. So your you-ness did not emerge. It wasn't created in the womb. You were you. Your sense of self, identity, was you from your very first moments. In fact, I remember my mom saying that all of her children, all three of her children, had different personalities, even in the womb. That we all responded very differently, even in the womb. And then from birth, we all had different ways of interacting. So something was different. The bodies, the sperm and the egg came from the same sources, the same this, the same that, and yet very different. So why is that? Who do you belong with? Who do you belong to? All of this we don't know. So now here's the question. Are these relationships as important when you think about them in that way, in that context? Knowing that you have likely had many wives, many sons, many mothers, many fathers, many daughters, many religions, many tribes, many races. You have participated. If we know that these bodies are interchangeable from lifetime to lifetime, then what makes this one relationship more important than another? Let's ponder on that. All right. Let's pull up that contemplation. Let's have a few moments. Why don't you take, you can grab a pen and paper, and we will do this fairly quickly with the understanding that we are not going to stop with today. I want you all to contemplate this and think on this as sort of homework over the next 2 weeks, but also in terms of how you can start to integrate this understanding of relationship. Our desires lead to expectations, which we then place on our relationships. So when our mind is full of that not enoughness that we talked about earlier, then we're unfulfilled in everything. And then we create more desires. In turn, we become even more lost in samsara. So what are the kinds of expectations and conditions and not enoughness are you putting maybe on your closest relationships? Are there relationships? It's probably, some of this is, some relationships we have are very open and maybe less attached, less conditions. You may have relationships that you put less conditions on, that are maybe less, maybe you have less attachment to them as well, or less feeling even for them. But what are the kinds of expectations and conditions that you find with this context that you may be putting onto those close relationships, right? We can start with those closely held relationships. Those closely held relationships where we feel disappointed, let down, where we get irritated and frustrated. Those are good indications that we had an expectation that was not fulfilled. So when you start to identify those conditions and expectations, what about considering, this is a contemplation for the future or for now, but consider those same relationships without those overlays of desire? What if you took off those conditions? Is there some condition or expectation that you could let go? There's probably at least one person in your life that is maximally pinging your unmet needs or unmet desires or unmet expectations. And what would happen if you could let that go? It doesn't mean breaking off a relationship with them. It means getting in touch with what your expectations and conditions are that you're placing on them. And then trying, just seeing, experiencing, letting that go and seeing what happens. All right. Thank you for sharing. How about we take 2 minutes on that to write down. All right. Let's come back. And I want to cover our final verse now. That's verse 25. And this is one of the flowers, one of the tools that we're given to sort of begin to release our conditional expectations that we place on relationships, and maybe to hold ourselves in relationship in a different way. It says, waste not your efforts to win the love of or to fight against friend and foe, children and relatives. See yourself in everyone and give up all feelings of duality completely. All right. So in verse 8, the more attached we are to relationships, the more expectations that we have of how they should show up for us, who they should be, and therefore the more aversions that come up, because when people cannot fulfill those expectations, we have more frustrations, we have more dukkha, so more suffering comes about. We have more ideas about what they should and shouldn't do. We have more and more suffering. And then what does that suffering do? It brings us closer and closer, and we get more and more enmeshed in samsara. We get more and more enmeshed in what we think is real. And so what happens in verse 25, this is based on this understanding that the less attached we are, the less surprised we are by when things happen in samsara, and the less delusion that we have. So ultimately less suffering. And so we're given tools here. So what are we just asked to do? Just stop wasting our time. Stop wasting our energy and our efforts. If all of our focus is focused on winning the love of or fighting against either friend or foe, because we try and win the love of our foes as well, right? If they could only see, they only knew, if they only did this thing and related to me in the way that I want them to, then they would know. They'd be told, right? We also fight against our friends, our frustrations, and we take it out often. Often we take out our frustrations maximally on our friendships, and because they're close, and We wanted them to be different even more than we wanted the stranger to be different. Our children and our relatives, then we tie in obligation, right? There's responsibility. And so we're more likely to expect things from them, add conditions to that love. If you have had parents, if you've had parents, you have probably experienced conditions on that love, many unintentional, but conditions on if you were a good daughter, you would do this. If you were a good son, you would do that. Or why aren't you living your life in the way that I wanted? I set this all up for you to be this way, to live this life, to pursue that, and you're not doing it. That's frustrating. What's happening? So how do we do that? How do we give that up? Stop wasting our efforts. Here, you can stop sharing. Stop wasting our efforts. That's important because, why? Because we have limited time. We have a limited time in this samsara, and as spiritual aspirants, as beings who are ready to shake off the moha, the delusion. We're ready to see what's underneath. If that's truly our goal, turn Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam. Turn towards the ultimate, turn towards the eternal, turn towards the real. How are we going to do that? Stop wasting our time trying to change what isn't ours to even change. Stop trying to receive fulfillment out of these relationships that we already know are conditional, because we're placing conditions on them. We're placing expectations on them. So why are we wasting our time with that if what we want is to know the self? Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam. Turn towards. How do we do that? Start seeing ourselves in everyone, including those people that we're having fights with, including those people whose egos are not meeting our ego's demands. There am I. There is that. Eventually, really connect with, we're not just asked, we're told this is how to do it, right? Shastra first commands, then it protects, then it enlightens. So here's a command for us. If you want this, if this is what's real and what's important, then the way to do it, give up all that. Stop trying to make relationships happen in the way that you want them to, and focusing all of your attention. There was a verse, I think earlier, maybe it was verse 7, where it's, Adi Shankaracharya talks about, like, we spend our early youth, our childhood focused on play, our youth and young adult life focused on sex and relationships and passion and all this, and then we spend our old age, our middle and old age, focusing on worrying about the world and worrying about our relationships and worrying about all of these things that are all of our worldly attachments. When are we going to focus? Hardly anyone, that verse says, hardly anyone focuses on Parabrahman. Hardly anyone focuses on the self. So here we're given, this is our how-to, right? So here's our how-to. We're invited, we're commanded, if what we want is change, we have to see the impermanence. We have to understand that these relationships are largely conditional because our mind is creating conditions. The way to make them unconditional is by seeing yourself, your big self, in everyone. And then just give up those feelings of separation and duality. We'll learn more about how to give up those feelings of duality. But doing that is going to be key and paramount. So he doesn't say here, don't have friends and foes, children and family, children and relatives. He doesn't say that. He says, stop wasting your efforts trying to win the love of or fighting against. So stop efforting to make things different than they are, right? When we stop efforting to make things different than they are, then we stop efforting against impermanence. Just see yourself in everyone. And in the moment of fighting, in the moment of trying to make this person love you and this person understand, that's the time. That's the time to decondition yourself. That's the time to say, wait, there's Govindam right there, right there, right there. Oh, right there. Yeah. We have one more contemplation for the next 2 weeks that I would like you all to contemplate, to think on. And that contemplation is this: the whole point of Shastra, the whole point of the Vedic, the Upanishads, all the sacred texts, the Advaita Vedanta texts, all the Vedas, it's to know one truth, this Govindam, also known as Ishvara, also known as Brahman, consciousness itself. What keeps us from that knowledge is Veda Agnanam. And that's this, Veda means separation, and it's the ignorance or the lack of knowledge. So when we're staying in ignorance, we believe that we are separate. This is what keeps us from knowing that we're not separate. What keeps us from knowing that we are one is this ignorance of separation. So there's many ways that we reinforce this ignorance of separation. But one of the main ways is in relationship, is by continuing to look at other people as though they are different from us. So when we look for differences in other people, we're increasing our ignorance of this belief in separation. So even though we know that our life principle is the same, that consciousness in me is the same consciousness that left the body in that person, is the same consciousness in you that's looking at me on the screen. That consciousness is all connected. That consciousness is all the same. So even though we may know that, we still reinforce this belief in separation. So a good contemplation for all of us to have as we're grappling with relationships and the illusion of the permanency of that and the experience of living in relationship is start looking at, how do you reinforce difference in your relationships? How do you reinforce this belief that you're separate from others? What are the ways that your ego, your mind, your pathological belief in separateness helps reinforce that belief in others? What are you doing to add to that? And then when you start to see those ways that because most of us have habituated ways in which we kind of learn to reinforce that separation. So these come from past experiences, past relationships, past lives, but we tend to all have ways. And I bet you can determine a few ways in which you tend to reinforce that separation. If there's a habit of how your relationships end, your romantic relationships end, you'll see some information in that. If there are, what are the ways? What are the ways in which we each reinforce differences between us and other people in our relationships? So start paying attention to that. And then a contemplation on that then further would be, how can you remind yourself in those moments and always, how can you remind yourself of your shared oneness? What is a good reminder for you, right? What is the way, is there a specific way? If you tend to habituate in one way, what will break you out of that? When you're not in the moment affected by it and you can contemplate, it's a great time to think about, what are the tools? What reminder is going to break through that habituation? All right, let's stop sharing that. Jema, thank you.